This is lecture 9. It's on the digestive system. Well, nutrition is an important topic that's not always considered carefully when discussing digestion, but it is an important topic. This is the material that has to be digested that has to be digested and broken down in order for the nutrients in it to be brought into the body tissues. Now, animals are heterotrophs. They get their energy and they get their carbon skeleton molecules from other sources, either other heterotrophs, which are other animals, or from autotrophs, which are plants. Whenever we consider what kind of nutrition or metabolism basis an organism has, we consider two key what their basic fundamental needs are two. One is a source of energy, and the other is a source of carbon, organic carbon molecules with carbon backbone. Organisms like plants get their carbon from carbon dioxide, and they get their energy from sunlight. Organisms like us, humans, or animals, get their energy and their carbon skeleton by eating other organisms like heterotrophs or autotrophs. In the end, three of the four major kinds of molecules are important in nutrition: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Nucleic acids, which are present, of course, in all food, because all food is made up of cells, and every cell has a nucleus, but nucleic acids are not that important a nutrient. It's carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that will supply animals with the energy and the carbon that they need. The nutrient is an absolute requirement for viability, and anything that contains nutrients can be considered food. We have evolved under very intense pressure to use food efficiently. Our metabolism uses it very efficiently because during evolution, over years and years, for almost all of our existence, human existence, there have been many periods where food was scarce through every year, in fact. So natural selection would preferentially allow survival of those that can use food most efficiently. There are several different feeding categories in terms of organisms out there. Saprotrophs and detritivores will eat dead organic matter. They're filter feeders that strain the environment for food. Herbivores eat strictly plants. Carnivores eat strictly animal tissue. An example of that would be cats. Some people out there try to turn their cats into vegans, and it kills their poor little cat, because cats are carnivores. They have to eat meat. Omnivores will eat anything, either plant or animal-based tissues, materials, and humans are that, as well as dogs, actually. So the nutrients can be assessed in terms of their energy content, and that's measured in calories. If we take in more calories than we need, it will be stored away as glycogen in the liver, and it's truly a storage form of nutrition in terms of that it can be mobilized from the liver into the bloodstream. And we also will store excess caloric intake in the tissues as fat. And again, that's readily available. It can be mobilized. If there's insufficient caloric intake, that would lead to the mobilization and breakdown, metabolism of stored glycogen from the liver and also from fat tissues, as well as breakdown or metabolism of protein. And the major source of that protein is from muscle tissue. Now this is a diagram, this is a graph looking at stored energy body reserves and versus weeks of starvation. So if a person is not eating at all, they will very, very rapidly deplete their carbohydrate stores, which are the glycogen stored in their liver. And they will also start working on the fat, and the fat is what fat tissue is what keeps people going for quite a while. But they will also at the same time start using and breaking down protein. So you will get wasting of muscle tissue, not only loss of fat, but also wasting away, or it's termed that, wasting away or cachexia, loss of muscle tissue, because the body's also drawing protein out of the muscle tissue. In many animals, the food provides the, as I said earlier, the key carbon skeleton molecules that are needed. The term, whenever you see the term essential used in reference to something, molecule or a nutrient, it's because it is in fact termed essential because the body can't synthesize it. A lot of the molecules that we need are able to, the body metabolism can synthesize it from other related molecules. For example, most of the 20 amino acids that make up protein can be synthesized from other amino acids, but there are 8 essential ones. So if it's termed essential, and there are essential amino acids and also essential lipids, if it's termed essential, it means it has to come in the diet, it has to be eaten, cannot be synthesized by the body. So as I said, humans require 8 essential amino acids in their diet. All 8 are available in animal-derived protein sources like milk, eggs, and meat. It is possible to get those 8 from vegetables, but no single type, no single vegetable contains all 8. So vegetarians have to be, for vegans, have to be very careful that they eat a proper mix of legumes in their diets to provide the proper mix of vegetable material to make sure that they get all of the 8. Certain, sources are, certain foods can be the source of some of the 8, but no one source provides all 8. So proper diversity of vegetarian diet is important. These are some of the essential elements that are required in diet by human diet. These are elements that must be taken in the diet and are important in different metabolic processes, as well as in the synthesis of key molecules. They include calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, magnesium, iron, and fluorine. I would not try to memorize everything on this table. Read it for your own interest, I would say. That would be the better thing to do. But know these, at least, that these are key essential elements. The mineral elements can be divided into macronutrients and micronutrients. The macronutrients are required in larger amounts than the micronutrients, and it's actually quite small, but the ones I was talking about before, at least most of those are considered macronutrients: calcium, chlorine, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium. So don't memorize them. Don't worry about them. I said to learn it before, but I mean, you should know that certainly the calcium and magnesium, it's common sense if you have some basic understanding of metabolism that these are key cofactors, or sometimes these are key to quite a few enzymatic activity pathways that require enzymatic activity, and without calcium, magnesium, you won't get appropriate metabolic pathways operating. Calcium, of course, also is important for bones. Chlorine's very important. Potassium and sodium, of course, and sulfur. The micronutrients include a fairly long list of somewhat maybe obscure elements. Again, read it for your interest. Understand some of it maybe we'll come back to, and I'll mention again. We have already talked about iron in terms of hemoglobin. There are, in fact, a number of heme containing molecules besides hemoglobin. There's also myoglobin, but there are also several key metabolic enzymes that are non-heme iron containing enzymes. So non-heme iron is quite important in enzyme activity. I think we can move on from here. Now, if a nutrient is required in the diet and you're not getting it in your diet, that can lead to malnutrition. So any essential nutrient lacking from the diet can lead to malnutrition, even if it's just that one thing, that one micronutrient element. It can lead to a deficiency. For example, and this used to be actually quite common in populations that lived further away from the ocean, iodine deficiency leads to a very characteristic type of malnutrition. The thyroid hormones produced in the thyroid gland that's at the base of the neck requires iodine. It incorporates iodine and needs iodine for activity of the thyroid hormones. And if you don't have an adequate iodine in your diet, then you will trigger the body's responses to start making more. You get what's called hypertrophy of the thyroid gland. It starts to get bigger because the body's trying to make as much thyroid hormone as possible. It's lacking it, so you get an enlarged thyroid gland. You know, the thyroid gland actually is very, very efficient at taking up any iodine that enters into the diet, because often human populations were lacking iodine. Now, of course, iodine is added to the diet because all the salt that we use in our diet is supplemented with iodine. The increase in the thyroid gland size was called a goiter and was extremely common years ago. In the Middle Ages, it was considered a sign of beauty in women. So, let's talk about vitamins. Vitamins are organic molecules that have to be obtained in food. They can't be synthesized by the body tissues. They're essential. They have to be eaten, or they are made. Some of them are made in the gastrointestinal tract by bacteria, and then are absorbed into the body. Some, like vitamin D, do require sunlight, exposure to sunlight, in order to get metabolically active vitamin D into the body. There are water-soluble vitamins and there are fat-soluble vitamins. Just because they are called vitamins doesn't mean they have any similarity at all in their molecular structure. They are all quite different, but they are all key essential molecules that have to be eaten, have to be obtained through food or bacteria that are living on the food in your gut and then producing, and it gets absorbed from there. An example of a vitamin which is made by bacteria, and that's the only source really, is vitamin K. The fat-soluble vitamins include A, D, E, K, so ADEK. That's how I remember it. A deficiency in any one of these vitamins in the diet will lead to a characteristic type of malnutrition associated disease. And here are the a list of essential vitamins that are required by humans. And again, read it for your own interest, just like the micronutrients and macronutrients. Some sort of common sense things you should know, I suppose, but other than that, mainly just read it. Again, from another source, these are the water-soluble ones. I believe the previous slide also had the same list. I'm not sure. Can't go back on this, but these are water-soluble, and here are the fat-soluble ones, A, D, E, and K. The kind of deficiency symptoms are very, very characteristic for each. For example, vitamin K will lead to blood clotting, deficiency in blood clotting, because some of the clotting factors require vitamin K as a cofactor. Well, one important molecule inside the body, which is used to store carbohydrates, is called glycogen. It's found in the muscle and also in the liver. In fact, in the liver, it can form up to 10% of the weight of the organ, or it can form up to 10% of the organ. And it's a fairly large organ after all. The role of glycogen in the muscles and the liver differ in that it's present in the muscle and used in the muscle, whereas in the liver it's stored there for later mobilization outside of the liver. So if you have stores, and normally you do have stores of glycogen in your liver, if the blood glucose level drops, then glycogen will break down into its individual building blocks and release, which are glucose, and will release into the bloodstream to raise the glucose level back up. Whereas in the muscle, it goes in, glucose goes in, it gets formed into glycogen as a storage form of carbohydrate, but is used within that particular muscle itself. Now the molecule is actually always called a carbohydrate. It's a polysaccharide made up of glucose monomers, monosaccharides, molecules of glucose strung together into a very large polysaccharide structure. It can vary in size up to 50,000 glucose units in the molecule. But actually at the very core of every glycogen molecule, you will find a protein. It happens to be called glycogenin, but that's not, I wouldn't ask you that, but there is a protein at the core of every glycogen molecule, and the glucose are added onto that and build up. Glycogen, of course, when it's needed, can supply glucose, because the glucose quickly is broken off of the polysaccharide, and it's used for as a energy source in the production of ATP through cellular aerobic respiration, in other words, oxidative phosphorylation. Now, during exercise, in terms of the glycogen stored in skeletal muscle, during exercise it gets broken down to glucose and then used by the skeletal muscle tissue as an energy source. And if it does become depleted, if the stores of glycogen in the skeletal muscle become depleted, then the organ, each muscle of course is a separate organ, then each organ can of skeletal muscle can use glucose from the bloodstream. However, if the glucose in the bloodstream is depleted, then glycogen stored in the liver will be broken down into glucose and the glucose released into the blood, and that's what's meant by mobilization of the glucose. So glucose is mobilized from glycogen stores in the liver, enters the bloodstream and gets delivered to any cell in the body that requires it for generating ATP. Okay, now in terms of an individual being able to carry out any kind of exercise at all, any physical activity at all for any longer period of time, it all really does depend on the glycogen stores in your body rather than the amount of lipid or fatty acids present. And therefore, a diet rich in carbohydrates can actually ensure the maximum amount of stored glycogen is on board before a long term or long time period exercise is carried out. In fact, in preparation for endurance competitions, long races, either foot races or swimming, bicycling, things like that, really aerobically taxing exercise. Often a dietary regime just before called carbohydrate loading is a routine part of the preparation to ensure that there's full storage of the maximum amount of glycogen in the muscle and the liver. Okay, let's get down to the actual process, physiology of digestion and absorption of foods. The digestion really is a breakdown of the food that you eat into small enough molecules that they're able to be absorbed through the wall of the small intestine, so the nutrients can be taken up. The actual process of digestion will take place in the digestive tract, starting in the mouth and going all the way down to the end of the anus. The process of digestion or breakdown of molecules made up of the food that you eat is made up of these four major biomolecules: lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And digestion is the breakdown of those molecules, so it has to occur outside of the space of the body tissues. Inside that space, which is external to the actual body tissues, but which runs from your mouth down to the anus. So that's where the digestive process has to occur. Otherwise, if it occurred inside your tissues, the enzymes involved would break down your tissues, because they're also made of the same, four major types of molecules: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. This is a pretty good summary diagram showing the different processes that are occurring along that route, going from the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, down to the rectum and anus. And that's the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract or intestinal tract. And there are also accessory organs like the liver, pancreas, salivary glands, which provide additional components and secrete them into the GI tract to help with digestion and absorption. Digestion itself, as I said, is the breakdown of polymer molecules that we eat. including these 3 of the 4, the nucleic acids are not a major source of nutrients, really. So they're broken down into their monomer. The monomer for carbohydrates are monosaccharides, proteins are amino acids, and lipids, of course, are glycerol and fatty acids. And then these monomers can be absorbed and used by the cells in the tissues. Most animals, typically, the way it works is there's an extracellular digestion process occurring within a tubular gastrointestinal tract or gut. And there are different specialized regions within that gut or digestive tract for different digestive functions to occur. The common feature among almost all multicellular animals in terms of digestive tract is that the surface area is vastly increased in order to provide a very large surface area so that you have the ability to have a lot of absorption over that really large surface area. In humans, we have these folds, intestinal folds all along the intestine, and then there are small processes sticking up from those folds called villi, and the villi are covered with a single layer of cells, as shown in this diagram here. You can see that single layer of cells. I'll just follow it here with a different color. So there's a single layer of cells all over that entire surface. This is a cross section, but each of these villi is completely covered with a single layer of cells. And even at a further, higher magnification, you would see that there are extensions at the surface of each of those individual cells to further increase the surface area and therefore potentially increasing the area available for absorption to occur. Again, here we see the diagram showing the major organs, including the salivary glands. There are shown 3 pairs of salivary glands, the parotid, sublingual, and submandibular. These are in pairs. I should tell you that last year they discovered a 4th set of a 4th pair of salivary glands that are right at the back of the pharynx back here. The mouth leading to the esophagus, and then the stomach and small intestine has 3 sections and they are in order going from anterior to at the progressing along the intestinal tract. The first section of the small intestine is the duodenum, right after the stomach, then the jejunum, and finally the ileum, which leads to the large intestine. Right at the junction of the large and small intestine is the appendix, just hanging off of the beginning of the large intestine. The large intestine, the very first section, by the way, is referred to as the cecum. I'll write that for you. Cecum, sometimes written with an A, but C-A-E sometimes, but C-E-C-U-M is perfectly good. That's a U, cecum. That's the very first section, this area here of the large intestine, with the appendix hanging off of that. And then finally the rectum and anus. And as I mentioned earlier, there are accessory glands, including the pancreas, the liver, the salivary glands, or the salivary glands are accessory organs of the digestive tract. The gallbladder could be considered, is an accessory organ. It's a storage site for bile produced by the liver. Okay, the overall organization. You might see it better in later diagrams, but the overall organization of the gut in a vertebrate animal is similar, and are more or less similar along the length. Different parts are somewhat different depending on what section of the gastrointestinal tract you're in, but the innermost layer here, which is in contact with the space, the internal space or internal lumen, is called the mucosa. It has a layer of tissue which is secretory and is the digestive surface. Below that is the submucosa, where you find secretory cells and the glands and blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. And outside of that is a smooth muscle layer, which helps move food along and helps with the digestion, mechanical features of digestion. And you have between those muscle layers a nerve network, which is quite extensive. So again, here you see a magnification of that diagram. There's the mucosa, the very innermost surface here in the gastrointestinal tract, and below that the submucosa. And then the muscle layer, there's a circular muscle layer and a longitudinal muscle layer, and in between that are mixed in there is a nerve network, nerve tissue. You have lymph nodes and lymphatic vessels and blood vessels in the submucosa. And this obviously is a section of duodenum because they're showing the pancreas and the pancreatic duct emptying into the intestine here, and that occurs in the duodenum. Okay, so in terms of actual breakdown of the food that's occurring, the enzymatic processes involved in breakdown, these are biochemical reactions, and they begin actually in the mouth with enzymes that are found in the saliva. The main enzyme found in the saliva is salivary amylase. Salivary amylase will act on polysaccharides to break them down. There is also, and a lot of people don't realize this, but there is also, well, I'll get to it later in just a second. So, with taking food into the mouth, it's mechanically digested using the teeth and the tongue, and it's mixed with saliva, which has enzyme in its salivary amylase, and then it is a bolus is formed and swallowed. So it's pushed to the back of the throat and swallowed, and that triggers a wave of smooth muscle contraction called peristalsis, which helps to move the food along from the esophagus and then down through the whole length of the gut. So you'll get these waves of contraction moving down through the whole entire gastrointestinal tract that are triggered by initial swallowing of food. Along the way in the tract, you have different areas where there are sphincters, which is smooth muscle areas that are thicker, smooth muscle areas that can, and here's an example of a sphincter which is found right at the junction between the esophagus and the stomach, called the esophageal sphincter. There's another one at the end of the stomach between the stomach and the beginning of the small intestine, which is the duodenum, and it's called the pyloric sphincter. And these are areas with thicker muscle that can contract and block movement of food forward, or also prevent retrograde, in other words, backwards movement out of an area going backwards, like, for example, from the stomach into the esophagus, which you don't want, and that can be fairly unpleasant and even lead to damage to the tissue from acid, damage to esophageal tissue from acid. Well, this is a summary actually of processes that are occurring in terms of digestion of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and we will go through each of these in later slides, but Just in general, it's worthwhile knowing that there is, again, salivary amylase, which is secreted by the 4 different pairs of salivary glands and mixed with the food, and then the food is swallowed. There is no further digestion or digestive enzymes that are capable of acting on the carbohydrates until you get to the small intestine, where the pancreas secretes pancreatic amylase into the space of the duodenum. And this further breaks down polysaccharide carbohydrates into monosaccharides and disaccharides, which can be, here's the epithelial surface of the small intestine. So this is showing the food getting absorbed through. So monosaccharides and disaccharides can get absorbed through into the through the mucosa into the submucosa, and then going into the bloodstream. They're carried away from there. For lipids, there is actually, a lot of people aren't aware, a lingual lipase secreted by the tongue, which can start the process of breaking down lipids into monoglycerides and fatty acids. Monoglyceride, by the way, is a glycerol molecule with 1 fatty acid chain attached. I would remind you that triglycerides, or neutral lipids, fat, in other words, animal fat, is made of a glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains. So here, like glycerol backbone with 3 fatty acid chains coming off of it, and the monoglyceride is with 2 of those fatty acid chains removed. So it's only 1 fatty acid chain, and the other 2 are free. Once that has been acted on by lipase, there's lingual lipase, and then in the intestine you have entry from the pancreas of pancreatic lipase, and actually bile salts are quite important in the process. So bile from the liver has to also enter, and then they can undergo a process of absorption. So they have to get broken down, and they have to be combined with bile salts, and I'll go into more detail later on. So this gets absorbed in to the cells that line the surface of the gastrointestinal tract. It gets absorbed into the mucosa, where it gets converted back into triglycerides, this kind of molecule, glycerol and 3 fatty acids. And so it gets reconstituted back to that, and then forms into what are called chylomicrons, and goes actually not directly into the bloodstream, but first into lymphatic vessels, and then eventually the bloodstream. In terms of proteins, this is just a quick review. I'm going to go into it in more detail further on. In terms of proteins are acted on first by the enzyme pepsin, secreted into the stomach, breaking them down into smaller polypeptides. And then in the lumen of the stomach, pancreatic, it doesn't say pancreatic, but all of these are formed from the pancreas and secreted in to the gut. So these are pancreatic proteases. Protease is a general term for enzymes that can cut or cleave polypeptide chains. So all of these, trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, all can cleave polypeptide into short peptides and free amino acids, and then the amino acids will be absorbed through the mucosa into the submucosa and into the bloodstream. Okay, let's go through that. So that was just a quick review over it, and we'll go through it in more detail here. Actually, it might be a good spot to stop. So this will be Lecture 9, Part 1. We're going to end here.